Hi, this is Paul. Via ordination by YouTube comment, I apparently am the pastor of the intellectual dark web. And as the pastor of this motley crew, I want to call attention to what may become a series that I'm calling Words That Fudge. And the first word I'm going to pick on is the word spiritual. Now, I've been doing a variety of conversations with a whole bunch of people, some of which show up on my channel, some of which aren't appropriate for public consumption. So when making this video, if you think I'm thinking about you, you're probably wrong. I've been talking about words that fudge for years. I've never phrased it exactly that way, but spiritual has been on my top 10 list of words that fudge for a very, very long time. And it's not just based on any conversation that I might have with you. For a while, actually, when I first got to this church, there was someone who used to write me emails after my sermons complaining that I was writing my sermons specifically for this man. This made me laugh hysterically, and it also gave me a certain degree of validation, because every preacher wants to be speaking to, every preacher wants anybody listening to them to be imagining that they're talking to you personally. Sometimes it's a sign of mental illness when you think everyone on TV is addressing you personally. So if you're having that experience, you might want to see a doctor. Anyway, let's jump into the biggest culprit, which is spiritual but not religious. Often when people say this to me, they say it to me as if this is some grand, unique, individual insight that they have come up out of the deep depths of their own authenticity. I usually am trying to be a pastor and showing a bit of compassion, so I smile and I don't laugh or cry, because spiritual but not religious is about the biggest cliche you can imagine. And it's been around for a very, very long time, and people who come up with it, they've heard it once and they just think, this speaks exactly about who I am. Okay, it really does, and which is why my general rule on words that fudge is that you should avoid using them whenever possible, and if you do use them with extreme care. Now, I know that it's difficult sometimes to avoid using some of these words. Some other of these words are on my list are consciousness. God, perhaps, could be on the list, the word God. If you listen to Jonathan Peugeot, he often wonders if he should be talking about God at all, and there's some wisdom behind that. So, spiritual but not religious. Now, religion and religious need work too, but they're not fully fudged yet. And so maybe if this does become a series, I will do a video on religion or religious. They're both important words, but they tend to have a little bit more cohesive public understanding still, even though obviously religion is a hotly debated thing. And yes, I'm working on thinking how I'm going to present these Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations. And like I said before, I'm not going to actually do videos on them by using video and audio from that until Peterson himself or Pangburn releases them fully publicly. And for those of you who want to watch them, there are plenty of places now to find them on YouTube to watch them in advance. Now, spiritual but not religious often comes out with something like, I don't go to church, but I consider myself a spiritual person. And if I'm in a context where I can engage in a little bit of conversation with a person, I will usually ask them, well, what exactly do you mean by a spiritual person? And for the rest of the conversation, I'm going to listen carefully for how they use that word spiritual, because even if they themselves don't have a good definition of spiritual, as I've said before, our conscious minds are this junior partner of our brain, and someone picked it up in one of my comments recently where I noted that the rest of our brain doesn't look at our conscious selves as probably the most reliable member of the committee. We don't trust our conscious selves to keep our hearts beating. We don't really trust our conscious selves to drive. We don't trust our conscious selves to keep us safe from quickly flying objects or fast-moving snakes. The rest of our mind considers our conscious selves requiring adult supervision, which is the rest of the unconscious mind. So when it comes to the use of a word like spiritual or other fudgy words, spiritual is a word that the rest of our mind has an idea about, but our conscious self has a pretty tenuous grasp. And what I'm going to be advocating is that as your pastor, if you consider yourself somehow in the webosphere of the intellectual dark web, in some webby corner of it or not, my advice to you is going to be bring more things into, do some work so that your conscious definition of these fudgy words actually have some meaning. So I don't go to church, but I consider myself a spiritual person. Well, what do you mean by a spiritual person? Now, when you finally do watch, if you haven't already, do watch the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations. Listen to every time, Sam Harris in particular, note when Jordan Peterson uses it too, but listen to every time Sam Harris says the word spiritual or spirituality and ask yourself, what does he mean by that? Because to Sam Harris's credit, he has been talking a lot about what he may or may not mean by that word. He at least has a degree of definition, which is more than most of us when we're using these fudgy words. Now, a spiritual person, the most common guess I can usually make about how someone's unconscious committee, their great cloud of witnesses, their Jungian cloud of witnesses between their ears, is an assumption of an individualistic but vague moral compass. Spirituality has something to do with morality, even with a fuzzy connection in people's minds. And they might say something like, a spiritual person wouldn't do that. Oh, okay. So why not? Ask yourself that question. What about spirituality? What about spirit impacts morality and impacts behavior? Now, can you map that moral landscape? If pressed to map that moral landscape, there isn't much beyond, for many people, an idiosyncratic individual intuition. Now, intuition is often the way that the rest of our cloud of witnesses talks to this junior partner that we identify with the conscious self. I'm going to check the phone. As I said, your conscious self is not considered by the rest of your mental committee, your committee of personalities, to actually be the most competent player on the board. So if pressed, your intuitions kind of fill in. And I'm not deifying the rest of your conscious committee. None of us are that good. But they're usually a little smarter than the one doing the talking, which is a terribly frightening thought for someone who makes YouTube videos and talks at you for hours on end. If pressed to map the moral landscape, there isn't much beyond idiosyncratic individual intuition, not much rationality. Now, I might do a video on words that fudge on reason or rationality, because there's a lot of fudginess around that word too. And if you want to hear a lot of the fudginess, again, when you're listening to Sam Harris talk to Jordan Peterson, pay special attention to how Sam Harris uses the word reason or rationality and what synonyms you could easily drop in. That's usually the way to figure out how someone is using a word. Figure out within this sentence, what word could you replace rationality or spirituality or spiritual with, and see if the sentence still works. And see if the person, at least in your mental imagination, if you don't have the opportunity to actually ask that person, see if that person would actually agree that that sentence with the synonym is roughly equivalent to the sentence with the fudgy word. So, not much rationality going into using this word spiritual or self-designating as a spiritual person. And my admonition for you as the supposed pastor of the intellectual dark web is use some rationality. Now, you might think I have to trade in my pastoral card by saying use some rationality, but if you haven't seen any of my videos on C.S. Lewis's Miracles, C.S. Lewis was a high believer in rationality. Rationality is a wonderful tool. In fact, for C.S. Lewis in Miracles, rationality is nearly the presence of God in our midst, and this image of God capacity that we have been given in order to colonize nature. And again, you can go back and look at my older videos where I talk about that if you want more information on that. Now, what's the relationship between spirituality and religion? Religions often map. Religions map these things that people are feeling intuitive in terms of their spirituality. Religions actually talk about it. And so when people are like, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, it's kind of like, I'm feeling but not thinking. And my admonition to you would be, start to think. Thinking is good. Thinking is helpful. Now, let's not make a God out of our thinking, but let's not make let's use it. God gave you this thing between your ears. He expects you to use it. So religions map this stuff, okay? And religions are, in a sense, very long communal conversations about this stuff. If you read Jonathan Haidt, you'll notice that, as Jonathan Haidt often says, we're smarter in groups than we are alone. So the wise person will listen to his friends and his enemies, to his allies and his rivals, and learn from the conversation. That's where wisdom comes from. And religion actually is the long written history of all of this wisdom of us watching each other. And this is where, if you think about Jordan Peterson and his entire project, if you want to get a sense on what we can know about ourselves, let's look at what we've been saying about ourselves for more than 50 or 100 years that psychology has been around. Let's go back thousands of years, and for the most part, the longest records we have about us thinking about ourselves, what we are, and talking about ourselves are almost all religious materials. And so you can learn a lot from religion. So if you say, I'm a spiritual but not religious person, my recommendation would be, might look into a little bit of religion. There might be something there you find interesting. There might be something there you find helpful. There might be something there. There might be conversations there that can illuminate your experience a little bit better. And I think part of how Jordan Peterson found his moment, at least for a certain segment of our community, is that he turned the lights on for a lot of people, and they began to say, maybe I should listen to something other than just my feelings. Now, often a spiritual person will use this phrase to identify themselves as not an atheist. And this is where I think we need to be kind and generous towards our atheist friends, because when you listen to the atheists playing the victim, they do have a point. It's very hard to be elected president of the United States as an atheist. People in general, normal people, regular people out there don't trust atheists. Why? Because there's probably some still haunted sense, again, this is built into their intuitions, still some haunted sense of divine justice. And so when they hear about atheists, they're not quite sure. They get an easy about religious people too, but atheists, yeah. Now it's not specified as much more than that. And to give atheists their due, at least atheists are offering a map. Now, albeit according to Sam Harris, and I think he's correct in this, that if you understand atheism to be merely the assertion that there is no God, it's not much of a map, but it's something, okay? And then they've got that, and then they've got their rationality, and they've got their enlightenment. They got a map they're working from. And again, this is often an upgrade from a lot of people that say, I'm spiritual but not religious. Well, do you mean there's a God? Yeah, I think there's a God. But then if you keep poking around in their thoughts about, okay, what do you think God is? You'll usually find kind of a junk drawer of accumulated ideas from Hollywood movies, from stories from grandparents, from visits of random churches, and peeks into random books, even associated with religion. You'll find all kinds of things like, I don't forget what day of the week they were hanging around with Maury, or chicken soup for the soul, or men are from Mars and women from Venus. I mean, people people are Velcro, especially their spirituality, and these little Velcro things just attach to anything that seems available. If you want a really hard knock on pastors, there's a really old good one, which is that pastors are quivering masses of availability. And there's way too much truth in that for me as a pastor to feel comfortable with. But people, when it comes to their spirituality, is very much that way. They're pretty much like someone wandering through an antique store, and they pick up something and they say, oh, this looks nice. Oh, this seems meaningful. And then their house, their junk drawer, and their curio cabinet, and the mantle of their fireplace becomes filled with these notions that they just kind of pick up. Now, again, if you think about the mind and the conscious self and the rest of the mind, their intuitions are talking. And I'm not saying that this habit and the things that they pick up aren't important, or that they aren't relevant to the person's life, to the person's story. They're very relevant, and this is why both pastors, now if you've seen a number of my interviews, you'll begin to notice that pastors are really, in some ways, thanks St. Augustine for this, in some ways something comparable to older versions of what happened in psychology. Augustine was one of the great old psychologists, and if you don't believe me, read his book Confessions. But if you want to know, and this is what I do as a pastor, if you want to know what's in a person's head in terms of spirituality or God, even an unformed religion, you begin to take a walk into their mental house and you start looking at the pictures on the wall. You open the junk drawer and you just poke around in it, and you look up in the curio cabinet and you see the kinds of things that they found meaningful and picked up. Now, part of the reason they don't trust atheists is because they imagine atheists don't have this stuff. And they have a degree of reason to believe atheists don't have this stuff because atheists say they don't have this stuff. But when I, as a pastor, listen to most atheists, I find them to be people just like everyone else. And I find them to have this stuff. And I think, again, once I start to take apart, especially Vancouver 1, the first video with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, listen to that. I've probably listened to that whole thing about 10 or 15 times now. And I'll probably listen to it another 5 times before I do a video on it. And you might say, well, you shouldn't listen to that. Why? Every time I listen to it, I hear more. My picture of Jordan Peterson gets that much sharper. My picture of Sam Harris gets that much sharper. My respect for Brett Weinstein. I'm thinking of doing a Hobbit-like metaphor for that talk, because they go into Mirkwood, and Brett Weinstein is, trying to keep Sam on track there, because Sam is in the brook and he's lost in the woods and he's all over the place, even though Sam Gamgee's is not in the Hobbit. Yes, I know. It's a very loose metaphor. I have my own curio cabinet full of things that I randomly pick up that say a lot more about my intuitions and my subconscious than my little conscious self, but you get the message. Sam is in the water a lot in that first video, and he's rummaging around the forest. Peterson is very much guiding Sam down the path, but Sam keeps wandering, and slavery. Oh, now we're going to talk about slavery, and stories, and now we're going to talk about stories, and texts, and now we're going to talk about texts, and then finally get back to religion, and then ghosts, and then we're going to talk about ghosts. So there's a little teaser for what goes on in Vancouver 1. But anyway, so let's be kind to atheists, but let's also be fair with atheists that, quite frankly, atheists, in my opinion, do have their religion of sorts. Some people turn their atheism into religion, or their rationalism into religion. And they do have their junk drawers and curio cabinets and mantles and shelves and walls filled with things that they've picked up in the antique store. Now the negative and vague profession that of atheism is designed to of a spiritual person is designed to avoid the atheist stigma and afford status. And this is a key thing to understand the personal identification as a spiritual person. being identified as a spiritual person still affords status in our culture. And this morning I was listening to Adam Defriended Think Club, his video where he talks to Pangburn. That's a tough thing that the atheists have to deal with, because they don't get any respect, or at least they don't get certain respect when you're out there in popular culture. If you're spiritual like oh shoot, why can't I think of that crazy Russell Brand? If you're spiritual like Russell Brand, if you're spiritual like the Dalai Lama, if you're spiritual like Richard Gere, if you're spiritual in these ways, this offers you social status, and don't deny it. And the atheists are the real losers. Now, Christians sometimes are losers in this game because Christianity can't get much respect either, but this is the way that social hierarchies go. And so when someone says, I'm a spiritual person, it's kind of a humble brag. Now, as I said before, spirituality still offers some social status, and to a degree Sam Harris wants to get in on the act. Now remember, these are words that fudge, and I don't think I hear anyone fudging more with the word spiritual or spirituality than Sam Harris, because I keep thinking, what on earth does he believe by that? What does he associate with spiritual or spirituality? Even celebrity atheists want to appropriate some of this for status purposes. And so Sam Harris will talk about his spirituality, about his meditation and his use of psychedelics. And to the best that I can understand, this seems to have an association with phenomenology or experience, but you want to keep it in that little box. You want to keep it in the iron box of materialism. Now, Jordan Peterson is very right that our internal systems are highly attuned to hierarchies and status, and that's why, in a way, Sam Harris doesn't want to pay the atheist tax, and this gets him into some trouble with atheists when he starts talking about his spirituality. But this I understand as, in a sense, they're trying to have some integrity and be credible by saying, hey, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in this. I'm willing to map this. I'm willing to go on record for reason and rationality. And I can respect that because they're being honest. They're saying, this is who I am. And it's much easier to have a conversation with someone who is to a degree in touch with himself and they're being honest. But yet he's still not quite willing to give up on the social status that spirituality offers. So in a sense, if we go back to the intellectual dark web, he wants to be cool like Joe Rogan, because Joe Rogan, if you go, let's see, I'll slide back to that beginning. I just found this on Google. Joe Rogan is the coolest of them. You gotta know it. And as Stitch and Think Club, Stitch and Adam, Dave Rubin he really wants to be in the club, and the Weinstein brothers, well, they're just really smart and interesting guys, but Eric Weinstein goes to synagogue for some very cross-pressured reasons. I think there's some good reasons, but I think in his case they're significantly cross-pressured. And of course, Sam Harris, he's front and center in this picture. And I thought whoever did this meme just really nailed him, because gotta be an atheist, but I don't want to lose the social status that spirituality gives me. So you can have your atheism and your spirituality too. Okay. So but Peterson, I think, is very right that we, in the Harris in Vancouver 1, Peterson is dead on right when he says, our emotions are tuned to status, and just in this little journey into YouTube that I've been on for the last number of months, I can really feel that. And I've got C.S. Lewis's admonitions about the inner ring, that C.S. Lewis basically says, good people will do really bad things just to get in the inner ring. And that's just another version in some ways of Jordan Peterson's hierarchy observation, that boy, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I believe in rationality. And you could be down with Pangburn in terms of his missionary effort to get rid of religions telling people to chop babies' genitals and telling people how to use their genitals, but we do want to keep our morality. And so Sam Harris is right in the front saying, I'm not a moral relativist. I believe in moral knowledge. He doesn't say moral knowledge, or does he? I'll have to go back and listen again. But this is where, of course, Dallas Willard comes into the conversation, because Dallas Willard, it's too bad Dallas has passed. Dallas it would be so fun to listen to Dallas Willard in these conversations, because here's a guy with philosophical chops and, you know, very interested in these conversations. And Dallas Willard penetrated right to the point. Do we have moral knowledge? Sam Harris wants to say yes, and he wants to say in his moral landscape we can get there from science, and Jordan Peterson isn't buying it, and I think Jordan Peterson's right. So now we have all these secular spiritualities, because there's status in being spiritual, but we're deeply cross-pressured. And someone sent me an email and said, have you read Charles Taylor? Yes, I've read Charles Taylor. I mention him quite often in my videos. We're cross-pressured here, because on one hand, there's still status to spirituality, and there always have been. If you read the book of, like, say, 1 Corinthians, there were some spiritual superstars that the Corinthian church was enamored with. And Paul is saying, you know, I get no love from you all. I get no respect. He's playing a Rodney Dangerfield, and so many of you are too young to even know who Rodney Dangerfield was, so Google him and look him up. He was a very funny man. But so now we have these historical, we need historical connections. We go into the antique shop to pick up our little curios. And again, one of the things that's really surprised me in the last few years, maybe, you know, I am the quintessential pastor living under a rock, not paying much attention to what's going out there in the hip world of secular spiritualities. You have these revivifications of ancient spiritualities that can be secularized, like Gnosticism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism. And this just fascinates me, because I know for some of you, hearing that there are still Calvinists around, you think you're looking at dinosaurs. But I think I'm looking at relics when people say I'm a Gnostic, or I'm a Stoic, or I'm an Epicurean. And I think, wow, that's interesting. I'm not casting aspersions here. It just fascinates me. And it makes me ask questions about where exactly we are in terms of, are we more like the first century? But we don't have the brutality of the Romans, and you can listen to Tom Holland talk about that in his conversation with N.T. Wright. We don't have that kind of brutality, but these philosophies, and if you look at, I did that on Twitter. Sometimes my worlds collide, and what I put on Twitter I didn't put on here, and I don't remember if I've done it both. But there's Eat Religion for Breakfast. That's a YouTube channel, and a lot of really informative YouTubes he puts on. Also look at Ryan Reeves. He teaches at Gordon Conwell. A lot of good church history YouTubes Ryan puts on. But Gnosticism was, in the ancient world, was kind of a tendency, and now it's kind of its own thing. It's kind of, Ryan Reeves talks about docetism and well, maybe I should jump in there. No, I really can't just pull it in because I did my settings different, and I'm not going to monkey around with it. Maybe I'll put links in if I remember. But so it's interesting how these ancient philosophies, even Gnosticism, it's highly debated whether it was actually a thing in and of itself. And I made a tweet yesterday more about, you know, it seemed in the ancient world to have more of a derivative sense. It was always an adjective to some bigger thing, like Gnostic Christianity. It wasn't quite a thing in itself, and now it's kind of a thing in itself. Stoicism was a thing. Epicureanism was a thing. Gnosticism, scholars are debating whether it was a thing or whether it was kind of an overlay on what people imagined themselves to be. So, but again, my surprise that this stuff is coming up. And when I meet people and they say, well, I'm a Gnostic, I think, wow, that just amazes me. But then there's a lot of secular people who find that their basic agnosticism, fuzzy spirituality, even atheism is compatible with, forms of Hinduism, yoga, with Buddhism, with meditation. And again, you can hear a lot of this in Sam Harris. Secular spiritualities, are they rigorous enough to be taken seriously? And so on one hand, there's a certain cachet that being spiritual offers, but there's also a little bit of a suspicion that people who grab onto this word spiritual, they're keeping it fudgy, and they're keeping it fuzzy, and they're keeping it fudgy and fuzzy because they don't want to offend anybody, because they don't want to put a stake in the sand. And if they say, I do yoga because I'm trying to escape, the constant cycle of reincarnation, and I want to finally escape this illusion of ego and individuality and personhood and dissolve into the great sea of being. Well, hey, now there's definition to this thing. But I do yoga because it helps me feel good. Okay, I do yoga because it's healthy for me. Yeah, and in all fairness, I have to go to a Yoga 101 class tonight because I made a deal with my wife, and I got her to go to Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life tour in Sacramento, which she enjoyed. But I needed to make a deal to get her to go to it, and my deal was that I would go to whatever yoga thing she wanted me to go to. So I've been to some yoga classes with my wife before, and they're extremely humiliating for a man of my size and age, because you have all these women, they're just doing all the things right and left, and here I am, and I'm just huffing and puffing, and this big strong man who can't bend or hold or do all these things, and it's just humiliating. But anyway, there's a fudginess and a fuzziness to this word that is also out there. So it's both affording status, and everyone's got a little bit of suspicion about it. And at least if you're a Mormon, well, there's a lot of Jack Mormons out there, but if you're a Mormon or a Christian or actually, if you just say Christian, people, that's going to be, I go to the Christian Reformed Church. Well, that might mean something. Or I'm a Baptist, or I'm a Pentecostal, or I'm a Roman Catholic, or whatever. Spiritual, a little fuzzy. But it won't impinge on your lifestyle desires unless you can play sex and food angles to look principled and not Christian. Now, one of the really interesting things that I've seen over the last couple of decades, really, is how food has gotten back into the religious game, because part of what happened in the Reformation, and this again gets into Charles Taylor and this long question of the relationship between secularity and especially the Protestant Reformation, participant cause both, and food for Protestants kind of came out of the religious spectrum, and early on Calvinists were known as sausage eaters. Why? Because Roman Catholics had all kinds of food stipulations, and Calvinists, in their liberty, would flaunt it by eating sausage in front of Roman Catholics who were eating their fish on Friday because they couldn't eat meat, and so on and so forth. So in Protestantism, the whole food thing kind of got dropped, and it's been interesting to see how the food thing has come back in. And if you want to watch some really funny videos, watch Awaken with JP, not Jonathan Peugeot, but this other guy on YouTube. Has hilarious has hilarious videos just poking fun at all sorts of spiritualities, and I think his stuff is hysterical. Let's keep going. Now, for some people, spirituality is your religion. Now, this you might find offensive, but as offensive as Sam Harris finds it when Jordan Peterson says he's really mostly or partly a Christian. Because what religion is now, religion is also a difficult word to get a hold of, but I'm using religion here as your basic worldview orienting thing. Now, if you sit down and think through it, you'll discover that it is a religion after all. And it's not a terribly well-formed religion. It's not a fairly well-articulated religion. It's, again, like your house when I go in and look at what's on your mantle and the pictures on your walls and your tchotchkes in the curio cabinet and what you've put in your junk drawer. There's your religion. And I as a pastor, kind of look at all this stuff and piece this together, and this is the kind of thing that pastors do. And you might say, well, I do what feels authentic to me. And again, now remember that your conscious self is the junior partner of this grand committee inside of you, and the rest of the committee are all feeding things, and you're walking through the antique store and take that. Well, that feels meaningful. Take that. Well, that feels meaningful. Now, here's the thing. Is there, in fact, an implicit religion beneath it of the secret sacred self? And for a lot of trendy spirituality today, that's really where a lot of this is going. But what's amazing me is that a lot of people who, on one hand, are talking the secret sacred self, on the other hand, they're living in a world that has spent the last 50 and 100 years developing psychology and sociology, where I am a secret sacred self, but everyone else is constructed by their stories. Well, they're a Christian because they were raised in a Christian family. They're a Muslim because they were raised in a Muslim family. But I myself as the unique individual who is fully in control of my destiny, and my secret sacred self is now coming out as a flower and blessing the world by, you're one of us. It develops into a kind of solipsism where I am kind of the only one who knows, except for maybe some of those other great spiritual celebrity lights. But when we look at each other doing this, there are rather obvious patterns to it that individuals are signaling with their communities getting played out in status games, and this is what we see. So if you're not getting any status or love from the ladies or respect from the dudes, whichever group you want status from, then you try on different spiritualities and you go looking and you become a seeker. And even being a seeker, there's a certain amount of cachet, because being a seeker is kind of being open, like being spiritual. It's like, well, I'm a seeker after truth. Well, that's good. You should be a seeker after truth. And I think it's in the journey and not in arriving. Well, if you ever had a journey that never ended, that's closer to hell. The point of the journey is arriving someplace. Because if you're just going, and you might be listening because there's a couple that came by church and they decided to go on a road trip, and they visited here all the way from across the country, and they confessed to me, they said, when we started this road trip, we thought, a road trip would be glamorous, but then we're always on the road and we're sleeping in this place and that place, and we just want to go home and sleep in our beds. So, we're hobbits. We like our homes, but adventure is cool too, and so journeys are wonderful, but journeys are made wonderful by destinations, because a journey without a destination is rather meaningless. And so, think through some of those things. And if you still don't see the patterns around you, here are a couple book recommendations I can give you. Christian Smith wrote a few books about this, where he's a sociologist, and he interviewed many young people to ask them about their religion and their spirituality, and lo and behold, patterns emerged. Such a surprise. And as a pastor, this is the experience I have. I talk to lots of people about their religion and their spirituality, and patterns emerge. What a surprise! We are sociological creatures. We are formed by our environments. And David Brooks has really done a wonderful job in The Road to Character, where there's all these little, basically these little mini biographies that make up the book. And he looks at the transition. He looks at Adam 1 and Adam 2, and I've talked about this a little bit in some of my past videos. Adam 1 and Adam 2, and also a really wonderful book. Now, implicit in a lot of people's religion, which is their spirituality, is the assertion that I am the final arbiter of the moral landscape. And if I say it that way, and if you stop and think about it for a moment, other members of your committee might say, through a feeling of dis-ease, that's probably not such a good thing. Now again, because of this self-centered bias that we possess, Heidelberg Catechism says I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor, which excludes everyone else. And yes, I know for a lot of people they have difficulty loving themselves. I have an ego the size of California, and I just don't have that problem. And if you want to go to Twitter and see my answers on my Big Five, I posted it there for, I forget his name. Can't remember names. Don't take it personally. Bad thing for pastors. I get easily distracted. ADHD. Didn't leave me as a child. I still have it today. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, I'm the final arbiter of my moral landscape. That sounds okay when it's me, but I don't trust that being anyone else. And if we think about ourselves as just one person, if we can just for a moment push back the desire to be the center of the universe, we can begin to see that this is not such a great idea. We certainly wouldn't trust Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin or Chairman Mao as being the arbiters of the moral landscape. You probably don't trust Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson as being the arbiters of the moral landscape. You might not trust anyone, and you might not trust God. And that might give you an indication of who your God really is. You might see him or her looking back at you in the mirror, and if you do, take it from me, you've got a lousy God, because human beings aren't good gods. So Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson both begin the conversation. So what is Vancouver 1 about? It's about the moral landscape. It's about morality. It's about the big questions we all need to answer. How much difference is there between relativism and me being the final arbiter of what is right and wrong according to what I feel to be right? Lest you think Jordan Peterson is the first person to get into this. Oh, shoot, how long ago? 15 years ago? 18 years ago, read a lot of Larry Crabb. Who is Larry Crabb? Larry Crabb is an evangelical psychologist. And Larry Crabb has his definition of what happened in the garden in terms of we decided that we were the arbiters of morality. And this is the difficulty that Sam Harris has, because he wants to derive the moral landscape. He wants to derive morality from science. He wants to derive it from facts. And this is, in fact, the big conversation of Vancouver 1. It's really hard, as Peterson says. You have a interpretive framework through which you appropriate the facts, and that interpretive framework is in fact where the morality comes in, and so you have the fact-value distinction. And so Larry Crabb, as a Christian psychologist, basically says we get this stuff from God. Now, God 1 or God 2, and it gets complicated. Another psychologist whose name comes up quite a bit in the Jordan Peterson conversation is M. Scott Peck. Way back in the 80s. I picked this up used, and I love getting used books when they've been signed and someone has put a little dear message to someone, for someone in it, and yeah, they sold the book. Anyway, M. Scott Peck, do a little Wikipedia search on M. Scott Peck. Quite good books. M. Scott Peck kind of went off the rails, and This is what people do. We go off the rails. So, psychologists have been working on this stuff for a long time. Because I cleaned my office, I was able to find those books quickly. Woohoo! Cleaning your office is a good thing. Moral knowledge means that there's more objective moral landscape that demands submission. Now, this sets up the great conversation and Plato's Republic. What is righteousness? Justice. That's what Plato's Republic is about. The book of Jonah that I'm doing right now, and I did last week, rough draft. This week I'll have another rough draft. And you can find the finished copies of the sermons on my church channel. But the story of the book of Jonah is not okay with God's administration of the universe. And what you find in the Bible, when I finally do the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations, Jordan Peterson knows a lot more about the Bible than Sam Harris. Sam Harris, if he's really going to talk about these things, needs to learn more about the Bible. And I'll address this in there, because while there are Christians that treat the Bible the way Sam Harris imagines, and the things that you listen to how often in that video Sam Harris talks about what he's afraid of. There are Christians that treat the Bible the way that causes Sam Harris fear, but that's by no means, in my opinion, the way the Bible has been treated by those who know the Bible best. Now, maybe I'm warping the sample, and depends on how you want to get the sample. But Sam Harris, I think, tends to judge Christianity based on a certain convenient selection of usually American evangelicals. It's a tiny, tiny portion of Christianity worldwide, and this tiny, tiny portion, that's what I think gives away the political game. And again, go look up Richard Dawkins on Unbelievable. It's fundamentally a political dispute. But this is the great conversation. The book of Jonah. God is not a competent administrator of the universe. He should smite the Assyrians. They're evildoers. Why didn't you stop the Nazis? It's, the question beneath the problem of evil. The complaint beneath the problem of evil. Francis Schaeffer, how shall we then live? This is almost the only conversation that human beings have which is worth having. Now, spiritual in history, this word used to have a meaning. And go look for it. There was an ontological map where spiritual was located. What is Cupid, and how did that work? What was Socrates' diamond? How did that work? What were they talking about? Give some thought to that. Why is the third member of the Christian Trinity the Holy Spirit? And how does that Spirit function? There's a public mapping that we can only, that in some ways we can only sort of imagine or reconstruct in terms of the ancients. And this is part of the difficulty of being a human being. But this is what religion will do for you, because religions actually study this stuff. Not always explicitly, but implicitly. And this is finally one of the questions I have for Peterson, because Peterson's entire project says that actions express belief. And implicit in Peterson's project is that what were all these ancient religious of every religion, what were they doing in their practices, in their worship, in their art, in their cathedrals? So there's a moment in the debate where Sam Harris says, the art and the buildings, they don't bug me. And everybody laughs. And Jordan Peterson gets a little upset at that moment. And that's very interesting. And if you understand Peterson, you know why he's upset. Because Peterson understands human beings and the relationship between the religious ideas, the religious expression, and the art and the buildings and everything. Peterson sees that as one whole thing. And Sam Harris doesn't see that. And you have to ask yourself, Sam, dig a little deeper. And I'm not even saying dig a little deeper in terms of God. Study some more psychology. Read a little Jung. Do understand that there's a connection between what our committee in our head, beyond the little conscious yammering self that says, I'm a spiritual person, or I don't believe in anything, or Neo says, I don't like to think about fate because I don't like to think that I'm not in control of it. Oh, okay. Willful blindness, denial, avoidance, call it what you want. It's all the same there. The buildings and all of that is Peterson will say that going to Mass every week and going to confession and going to cathedral and going, let's say, to the Orthodox and seeing Jesus up on top of the dome, or going to a Calvinist service, which is very sparse, very plain, but the language and the liturgies, that all of that is important. But there's a certain elitism in Peterson in that, well, I can get there mentally, and I can map it in my maps of meaning, and I can do it psychologically, but I don't practice. What, you're too good to practice? You're too smart to practice? There's a, if Peterson says to Sam Harris, well, you're kind of a little 13-year-old snot atheist poking at Christians, well, there's a little bit of 13-year-old Jordan Peterson who doesn't want to go to church, because he doesn't want to sit and listen to the lying pastor who he gets fidgety in the 3-hour-long Orthodox service. Yeah, Peterson's a big boy. If I were to say that to him, he'd probably agree, because he's also a really honest guy. I'm a 55-year-old, but ask my wife, she'll point to times that I'm a 13-year-old, and I don't want to do things because that little boy inside of me just says, no, I don't want it, and I'm not going, and you're not going to make me. This is how we are as people. But spirituality and history, the words, when Paul talks about a spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15, well, what did he mean by spiritual? Now, part of the problem is very much with, now you might say, well, Paul, you're giving the spiritual but not religious a hard time, and you're giving the atheists a hard time. How about the Christians? Well, you're only watching my video. You're not sitting in my Sunday school class with me, because I give the Christians a hard time with a lot of fudgy words. Just be in my Sunday school class and use the word saved. I will pounce. Why? Because saved, the evangelicals have all this code talk, and they're all fudgy words, so that we don't actually have to explore and go into, well, what exactly do you mean by that word? Let's use rationality. Now, again, I don't think rationality is a tower. It is like building a tower, but the tower can't float in space. It's always grounded on something. It's always linked in by something. So watch these fudgy words. And when people use a lot of fudgy words, watch out. Because if they're smart and conscious, oh, there's a fudgy word. If they're smart and knowing what they're doing, they might be pulling the wool over your eye. If they're just using these words in a very fudgy way, it might just be that they're really vague on a whole lot of things. And it's those kind of people that a smart rival or adversary, psychologist or pastor can sit down and just begin tinkering around with it, and then they discover, oh my goodness, I was connected to all these fudgy words, and they just deconstructed all my fudgy words, and then they're actually vulnerable. Now, Sam Harris's spirituality, at least with Sam, we know what he says. It isn't. It seems to be going along with feeling, spiritual, and for a lot of people, spirituality is a feeling. Okay, well, that's your cloud of witnesses. The elephant, how does the elephant communicate with the rider? Can't pass him a note. Usually communicates with the rider by doing something, and that's why when you sit down in a room with a psychologist, and maybe you're sent there by someone, and so the psychologist will ask, why did you do it? And the truth is, you don't know why you did it, and that's the psychologist's job, to help you figure out why you did it. But again, the presumption is that there is a why. Now, if you're a skeptic, you'd say there is no why. We just do it. And if you're a materialist, arguably consistent with that philosophy, same answer. But Sam seems to associate spirituality with a feeling or phenomenological experience of a certain kind, something that, and this seems to validate his materialism, but the more you ask questions about the phenomenology of the psychedelics, and the more people say, well, a lot depends on a lot of different things. Well, what really gets validated, it seems, is more the depth psychology and the fact that you don't know what the heck you are, and neither do I, and neither do we, and we are mysteries to ourselves. And so you take a drug that's going to, go back and look at my conversation with James, that's going to basically take the control cop in your brain offline. Yeah, a lot of freaky stuff is going to flow. Well, and you don't even need to take a psychedelic. Just wake up in the middle of the night and do some work on thinking about your dreams and writing them down. Now, Jordan Peterson's spirituality. At least Jordan Peterson has a good sense to maintain some humility, even if it drives, I didn't get that word right, even if it drives the journalists crazy when they try to put him into a travel box. Peterson has taken a lot of the fudge out of his term, but there's still some fudge in there. And what exactly do you mean by spiritual? Now, a lot of Christians mean immaterial, and by that they give away how deeply secularism has impacted them. But basically what Jordan Peterson's been working on is he's trying to figure out what that word means, and that's one way to think about everything that he's doing. Now, he says, act as if God exists. And, again, this is why I listened to some of these things multiple times, because it's about 3/4 of the way through Vancouver 1 when you get into Peterson lays out his axioms. And at first time I really saw with new eyes what Peterson is saying when he says he acts as if God exists. Now, and sometimes some of you are going to hear this and say, duh, isn't that obvious? And I probably would have said that to myself, but I saw it in a different way this time, that this is his confession of faith. He's a pragmatist. What you believe is what you act out. And in a sense, now there's, again, some of this elitism in this 13-year-old boy who doesn't want to sit in church. In a sense, he is saying, I am acting as if God exists. And in some ways, he is a church of one. And it could be that for Peterson, if I were his shrink, I bet he doesn't. Now, someone had told me that Peterson said he's never seen a psychologist himself, which blew me away, and I put this to the professional psychologists in my meetup, and they all kind of scoffed at it too, because everything I know about just about every program of psychology, at least if you're going to be a practitioner and get a license, is that you have to be in therapy yourself. I mean, I see this all over the place, and plenty of pastors practice this too, because we recognize the validity of psychology and the helpfulness of therapy. So Jordan Peterson has never been in therapy with anyone? That would blow me away. It's also a little disturbing. But when Peterson, in a sense, avoids these boxes and says he acts as if God exists, to what degree is he too good for church? Is he too good for, only his Christianity is pristine? Now, I don't want to set this up as an unusual thing, because I think, quite frankly, this is at the heart of all of us. This is our core sin. This is Augustine's pride. This is C.S. Lewis's pride. And when I say that, I don't mean them. This is what they as people possess, but what they wrote about as being the cardinal sin, the sin out of which all other sins grow. That Peterson is in a sense saying, thank you, church, I'll take it from here. Okay. I don't need therapy. I'm smart. Okay. He's pretty humble too. So again, he's an interesting dude. He's an interesting dude. But this, again, thinking out loud, which is what all my videos are, thinking out loud about his answer as if God exists. That, Jordan Peterson comes into Living Stones and says, Jordan Peterson sends an email and says, Paul, I want to have a conversation with you. Let's do it offline. This is where I'd go, because there's something there. And I'm not saying it's a bad something or it's a evil something or anything. Everybody's got something. I got plenties of somethings. But there's something there. This non-church thing for a guy, it's like the doctor who never sees the doctor, or the lawyer who's his own lawyer. He's the therapist who's his own therapist. And at some point you have to say, there's something there. Could just be his Alberta culture, because again, I have my brother-in-law. If you look at Ann and Tom and my sister's YouTube channel, my brother-in-law is from Brandon, Manitoba, and he and his brother, who I knew his brother in college, and my brother-in-law Tom, boy, you get those, you back those guys into a corner, they're like a badger, they're like a wolverine, boy. They just burrow in, and Peterson, I see Peterson as he can do that sometimes too. Now, a lot of you are going to ask about Jung and Jungian spirituality. And again, I'll tell you, I'm just not quite sure what to think of those cats. I found the interchange between Jung and Freud, especially about the report in the cabinet, that was fascinating. That was the most interesting, not maybe the most interesting, but Jung is an interesting dude. Still not quite sure what to think of him. Seems to want to have it both ways, though. I think some ways in terms of ontology, seems to want to keep his secularist credentials and have spirituality too. And there's real tensions that where exactly is the collective unconscious located? Is it interpersonal? Would nuclear holocaust destroy the collective unconscious? We're all working from some kind of map. That's part of my point with this. Our maps are often fuzzy. All of us, we're all fuzzy. If you're not in some sort of submission to a tradition or community, chances are your map is likely fuzzy, idiosyncratic, and mostly anecdotal. It is filled with the tchotchkes and trinkets and things that you've picked up in swap meets and antique stores and in Hollywood movies, and every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. This is the stuff people pick up. Why? Because we need to pick it up. This is an aspect of the whole Peterson journey. But the problem is, if your spirituality is just you, it's no bigger than you. You've got a very shallow pond. You've probably got a pretty bad map, because it's just you, and it's maybe you and a few of the friends that you've talked about some stuff, and their map might not be any bigger either. And this is why people launch off and become seekers and read the Bible and listen to Jordan Peterson and go to yoga and read Deepak Chopra and read The Secret and listen to Oprah and go to Bali and eat, pray, love and find a pastor and they're trying to improve their map, and for the most part, better than nothing. At least they're doing something. At least they're asking questions. Do you have any sense that you're responsible for this or that it matters? I think you should. So a lot of folks are innocent spiritually abroad. If your map is largely unexposed, you'll likely be vulnerable to adopt whatever comes along and implicitly offers you status. Beware. This is where rationality can really help, because rationality, in a sense, and I think Ian McGilchrist is right, and that says rationality is basically a consistency device. Is this consistent with that? Is this consistent with that? Does this follow? That's how rationality is helpful. You cannot construct a world with it, but once there is a world, you can use it to look at things within it. That's how rationality helps. Now most people just float along, following the crowd, not appreciating that their authenticity compass is the product of their sociology, and it's just this deep. So, go somewhere, do something, get it a little deeper. And I find a lot of people with naive spirituality. I find many people have assumptions without a map, and secularism, which is their buffered self, and the combination of these things biases them in some very vulnerable ways. Now, G.K. Chesterton, it's probably apocryphal, was said to, people who give up Christianity don't believe nothing, they'll believe anything. And nobody's been able to track that down to G.K. Chesterton. But it's generally true not just of people who give up Christianity, but people, they might be in the church, but you see, then the church offers a degree of control and a haven for them. And most people right now, you know what I mean, even if I can't say it. Secularity is imagined to be like this grand open field outside of the confines of these closed, dark places, which are organized religions. And I'm going to go out, read the beginning of the book of Pi, where he talks about lions, how lions in the zoo last longer. Why? We imagine, they should be free on the Serengeti. Let's drag you out of your air-conditioned house and put you in the middle, naked and alone in the Serengeti, and see how you like it. It'll be the grand adventure. Yeah, you'll be crying for shelter and food and all of this stuff before you know it. This is why we develop civilization. But people imagine, I'm going to go out there into the spiritual world. Well, what makes you think the spiritual world is any less dangerous than the Serengeti? If there are spiritual powers, what makes you think they're benign? Now, the ancient world found spiritual realm as one of deadly and eternal peril. Why do you think the pharaohs stocked their pyramids with everything they'd need in the afterlife? Why do you think people were anxious about the afterlife and continue to be? There's a sense of, is it just the unknown? And we can psychologize it away if you want, but you do that at your peril too. What makes you think the spiritual world is benign, that you can just traipse into it, when you wouldn't do that in any city or even almost on any street that you didn't know? But that's what people think. Well, it's actually the combination of the buffered self that makes us feel like, we're immune to these things. Well, but if you go and you talk to ancient peoples, a big motivation for people's embrace of Christianity was an antidote to spiritual terrors, that Jesus overcame the principalities and powers, that Jesus cast out demons, and that demons would flee in Jesus' name. Now, modern secular people hear this and say, that doesn't have any cachet for me, but go to Africa and Asia and many other places and say, in Jesus' name, spirits flee. People listen. Why? Because they live in the midst of spirits. Read a little bit of Native American spirituality. People like to explore that. Read Blood and Thunder, Hampton Sides. Fascinating conversation about what the Navajo believed in terms of the afterlife. I mean, very spiritual people lived in terror through most of human history from the spirits. Now, secularity, in a sense, is seen as an antidote to this terror, because that terror is irrational. But now, after you've developed this buffered self, you're going to wander out into the Serengeti of spirituality and just be an innocent abroad. Yeah, naked and afraid. Go out into the Serengeti naked. Find a stick. Try to live for a year. Good luck. You won't make it. So, what do you do with these fudgy words? Stop using the word yourself. Now, there's a lot of times where you're not going to avoid it or it's going to slip out. Just start to be conscious of it until you have an idea about what you actually mean by it. Now Peterson Okay, Kindle. Yeah, I called you up a little bit later. All right. You can see some of the books I'm reading. Really excited about this new Alan Jacobs book. Anyway. Peterson found his moment because many people are simply floating along. And whatever you think of Peterson's answers, he's at least thinking about it hard. And what he's doing is he's bringing a lot of other people thinking about it and asking questions. And this is all good. And whatever Sam Harris says, I think Jordan Peterson is more rational. This is how I understand rationality to be, and I think Peterson is right that rationality constructs things upon presuppositions, but it's the presuppositions that matter. And where do these presuppositions come from? They're not from us. Well, where do they come from? Listen to the section about prayer fairly late in the conversation in Vancouver 1 with Peterson and Harris. Understand what rationality really is, and as Sam Harris uses it in Vancouver 1, a synonym for right or good. That's really interesting. So what will it cost you? Well, it'll cost you some status from posing. That if you're going to give up using the word spiritual, you will annoy your friends because, take it from me, I'm an annoying person in some ways. You will annoy your friends because they'll say spiritual, and you say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, they don't know what they mean by that. Good. Well, let's begin. What does the word mean? Well, not material. Well, does that really work? Well, are there beings? Jonathan, the conversation I had with Jonathan Pijel, that was very interesting. I continue to have thoughts about that conversation. A great deal of time and effort to work your map, to work out your map, to work on your map. Work on your map. Figure it out. Do some work. To have something down is better than to have nothing down. You may start believing something unfashionable. You may disagree with me. You may disagree with Jordan Peterson. You may disagree with Sam Harris. Neither me, Jordan Peterson, nor Sam Harris are God. You might develop a conscience. You might stop lying. See my conversation. I'm really surprised how well my conversation with Carl. That has been interesting. That really took off. Now, over time, you'll probably start to become a real person. Well, what do I mean by that? You won't just be human background noise in the universe. That's what a lot of people are. They're human background noise. Now, it's very interesting. One of the thoughts I had as I was going through the Book of Kings in my Sunday sermon series, I learned, it's the same as being a teacher. I always learn more than my congregation when I go through this stuff because I learn way more than I can ever possibly put in a sermon. But one of the things that occurred to me was as the nation of Israel assimilated in with the common spirituality of the ancient Near East, they simply became background noise in human history. Well-behaved women rarely make history. Well, neither do well-behaved men. The question is, do you have something to say? Do you have something to contribute? Well, you're only going to have something to contribute if you work on your map. Well, what's that going to require? It's going to require probably less time-eating things and more thinking and more reading and more talking and more actually doing. And again, this is where Peterson's allergy to church Christianity gets noteworthy, because you can read a lot of books and train the rider, but you train the elephant in church. You train the elephant in liturgy. You train the elephant in worship. You train the elephant in doing this stuff with your body, in submitting to a community. You train the elephant with a herd. You'll actually begin to actually have authentic ideas, if that word really, feels spiritual to you, and be able to map them. You can have all the authentic ideas you want. If they're not mapped, you're never going to be able to communicate them to anyone. You'll be able to locate others on maps too. Now, that's a, you know, David Fuller nicely included Jonathan and I in a tweet about his Gnostic interview, and I have to work on this, because if you go to my Twitter answer, I'm very high in openness, and so I really have to be careful. It's hard to figure out how to engage productively with competing tribes. Now, I, unlike Jordan Peterson, am well embedded in a tribe. And to a certain degree, you have tribal obligations, just like you have family obligations. So you want to represent your tribe. You want to speak up for your tribe. You want to be a good citizen of your tribe. To imagine that you don't participate in tribalism, a human being without a tribe is like an elephant without a herd. You're out there naked and afraid in the Serengeti, and you ain't going to last. So you need a tribe. But we as human beings have to figure out how to work our tribes. And so when I'd love to sit down with a Gnostic and talk this through. And now I know when I talk with people from different tribes on my channel, some people within my tribe, however you want to slice the tribes, get upset because they don't think I'm being a proper tribal citizen, because they have imaginations about what a proper tribal citizen should do, and me and those other people might have different imaginations. I think it's important to have a productive conversation, which means that I'm not necessarily going to kvetch over anything that the other person says that I might disagree with or even strongly disagree with. In the process of a conversation, I often want to learn what they think, and me raising objections in the middle of it is a good way to derail a productive conversation. And in fact, if you look at especially the first part of the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Vancouver 1 conversation, there's a lot of that. Peterson is very disciplined in the first section of that conversation. He's really disciplined, and let's get down to some agreements, Sam. And Sam keeps wandering over into these things that where Sam wants to go, but Peterson is very disciplined. And here's an agreement, here's an agreement, here's an agreement. Peterson is really driving that conversation, especially initially. And Sam is undisciplined. He's pretty feral in that sense, in that he's kind of over the map. But Peterson is, and then in some ways the conversation takes some different turns into Mirkwood. But if over time you map it, you'll have a framework to help you make important choices, to have ideas that people will find both interesting and annoying. You will actually become a person who can make contributions in this world because you will have something to offer. And it will govern your behavior. You'll probably start to practice a religion. Will it be your own religion like Jordan Peterson? Will it be your own church? But at least if you have a map, other people will want to talk to you, and more importantly, other people will want to listen to you. And now you have influence, but you're going to need a map, and there are no substitutes to developing one. And it's full of a lot of hard work, because people with maps know that human beings require training to become something, and religions are communities helping individuals with their training. That's what religious communities do. Whether you're practicing yoga or meditation or Christianity, going to the Mass, these are all communities. And when you get into there's accountability and there's discipline. And they're not going to let you say whatever you want to say. And they're not even going to let you think whatever you want to think. And this is one thing that comes up in the Peterson-Harris conversation, that one of the implicit values even of this free speech thing is that I can think anything I want to think. Now, yes and no. Yes, in terms of I'm a very big believer in people speaking honestly. You need that for process. But at some point, all fruitful journeys have a destination. A journey without a destination is not much different from being lost. And what happens here in a religious community is that the community helps you towards that destination. Let's say if you want to be an NBA star and you keep going out and playing flag football, at some point your coach is going to say, hey, it's football or basketball. We'll say, I want both. Okay, that might mean you'll have neither. Reality is like that. We're in time, we're in space. There are limitations to all of us. To be a human being means to be a very limited creature, and we don't like that. But it's the way it is. Feral humans are all around us. Now they're fairly well socialized, and they're spiritual but not religious, and they're having spiritual thoughts, and they're impressed with their spiritual moments. But don't be one. Get into some training. Now, I had an email conversation with someone who's been trying to get into church, and they've had some bad luck of it. And I understand that. It's hard. I've not been to the gym now in a few weeks, and that's not a good thing. I got to get back into the gym. But this is how we are, and this is very much the case with the words we use. So I should land the plane like I keep telling Freddie we have to. So I'll go all the way back to the beginning. Words that fudge. Spiritual. Be careful with that word. When you use that word, try to use it meaningfully. Try to use it in a way that doesn't just create social lubricant so that everyone can say, yeah, but actually have it have definition so that it can be placed on a map somewhere so that you can actually contribute to the conversation. So, hour and 20 minutes, not too bad. Words that fudge, spiritual. Be careful with it.